I want to thank you all for coming to the Richmond Art Center this afternoon, for joining us in a look at two very special exhibitions, David Park, Personal Perspectives, and the Human Spirit, Contemporary Figuration as an Expression of Humanism. We are very grateful today to have some of the artists with us from this exhibition who are willing to talk about their influences, their decisions that they've made in their work, and how they've come to the point that they've reached. So what I'd like to do is first introduce all four of the artists that we have with us today. Christopher Brown. Chris's paintings and prints have been exhibited in our galleries and museums throughout the Bay Area, and they have enriched our lives. The collections of the UC Berkeley Art Museum, SF MoMA, the de Young and the Achenbach Graphic Arts Foundation, of the San Francisco Museum of Fine Arts are all richer for his work. Currently a professor at CCA, Chris Brown has taught for the San Francisco Art Institute, and for 13 years was a stimulating influence in the development of our students at UC Berkeley, where he was professor and chair of the Department of Art Practice. A long list of awards ranging from Regents Fellowships to National Endowment for the Arts grants attest to the beauty and strong power of ever-evolving paintings. The award of 2 NEA grants for art criticism acknowledges the reflection and the intelligence of this artist's position in contemporary painting. Last week, we were mesmerized by Being Human, a performance developed and presented by Allan deSouza for the exhibition, The Human Spirit. Born in Kenya, raised in England, and educated in Britain and the US, Allan deSouza works through multiple disciplines to examine issues of the body, dislocation, memory, and history, making visible the impact of culture and politics on identity. deSouza has exhibited from LA to Mexico City to Philadelphia, New York, London, Düsseldorf, Johannesburg, Bialystok, New Delhi, Auckland. Allan deSouza has exhibited throughout the world. He is the former chair of New Genre at the San Francisco Art Institute and is currently professor of photography and chair of the Department of Art Practice at UC Berkeley. His fiction and critical writings have appeared in various journals and anthologies. Kota Ezawa uses animation and drawing processes to create abstractions of existing films, videos, and photographs. Born in Germany, Ezawa studied at the Kunstakademie Düsseldorf, then received his BFA from the San Francisco Art Institute and his MFA from Stanford. He received a Sika Award and a Eureka Fellowship. Ezawa's work is in collections including the Albright Knox Art Gallery, Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Ezawa's work has received solo exhibitions in London, in the Vancouver Art Gallery in Canada, the Hirshhorn, the Smithsonian, the Whitney, Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, and the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris. Kota Ezawa is an associate professor with appointments in film and in fine art at the California College of the Arts. Livia Stein first came to Berkeley from Southern California to attend UC Berkeley, studying history, and then pursuing a master's degree in South Asian Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She spent several months in India and has continued this intimate dialogue. With an interest in photography, Stein then studied at the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena. Her focus shifted to painting while working on a master's degree from San Francisco State University's Center for Interdisciplinary and Experimental Art. Her work has been exhibited in Europe, South America, India, and throughout the United States. Her work is in the collections of the Achenbach Foundation for Graphic Arts, the Oakland Museum of California, Dominican University, the University of Iowa Art Museum. formerly a professor of art at Dominican University, Stein has had residencies in India at the De Young Museum, and most recently she has just returned from Rome, where she was a visiting artist at the American Academy. So we have a wonderful, wonderful assembly of art, thought, and I think we're in for a very exciting afternoon. I wanted to start by asking Chris, who probably came upon the Bay Area art scene as the first of this group, what it was like when you actually came to it was to Davis, and those who were teaching there included Thibault and Arneson and DeForest and Manuel Neri. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your first exposure to the culture in California, at Davis in particular, and how you saw the work of Park and experienced it at that time.
I have to remember back. Let me think here a second. I think I first experienced Davis and the people who were at Davis, you know, as you say, including Thibault and Wiley, and the whole Bay Area figurative painting group, basically. I experienced those people as a student at the University of Illinois in undergraduate school, because many of them came to Illinois as visiting artists in the years that I was there. And that's why I wanted to come to California, because for one thing, when I was in undergraduate school at Illinois, almost every visiting artist who would come would say, well, if you really want to be an artist, you have to get out of Illinois. You should probably go to the coast, one of the two coasts. And that was pretty clear, I think, anyway. So it was New York or California, and this was the late 60s, early 70s, and so California, of course, was the answer. And so I wanted to come to the Bay Area, and fortunately was accepted into graduate school at Davis. And bit by bit, I started to find out who these people were, and find out a little bit about people like Elmer Bischoff and David Park, who I'd never really known about until I got there. Elmer Bischoff was one of the first people I met when I was in graduate school outside of the faculty at Davis, because Elmer was having a show at the Oakland Museum, retrospective show. This must have been about 75, 76. And so I went to that show and I met him. And that was kind of a revelation for me, all these small things, you know, that happen in your life that you don't take so serious at the moment, but in some ways stay with you. But the art world in the Bay Area at that time, I think, was a pretty small place compared to what it is now. And it was pretty focused on painting and ceramic sculpture a lot too. I mean, these two sort of dominant trends of the Bay Area art world. And now it's grown so much to include so many other things that gradually grew in those early years, my early years in California, through the late 70s and early 80s, with the advent of things like video and photography becoming much more popular and performance art becoming a part of the art scene. None of those things existed, really, I mean, or just very minimally when I first came to graduate school. So, in a sense, the core remains, but the art world has grown much bigger and broader than all that, too.
Yeah.
So.
Livia, I think you want to take the microphone probably, yeah, maybe to use, yeah. You had a very unusual path to painting, and maybe you could talk a little bit about what drew you into painting and how Park's painting stands amongst those things that have held your interest.
Yeah, well, as you said in your introduction, I started out thinking I was going to be an academic, you know, that I was going to get a PhD in history, and that I had this feeling that if you understood history, then you could save the world and that people would stop killing each other. I was totally wrong about that, but that was my initial feeling when I was a very young person, you know, like in high school. And I think it was going to India the first time that led me to being an artist, because I saw it through a much more personal way. It's like the academic just didn't have any relevance or interest to me. And I came back from India and I had all these film to get developed. My father was a photographer, and he wanted to grab it from me and develop it and everything. I said, no, I'll do it, you know. So I just set up a little dark room and I started doing the photography and making prints, and it came pretty easily to me. And at that point, I thought, I'll be a photographer. I'll go back to school and I'll do something practical. I'll do public relations, I'll do weddings, I'll do whatever. It'll be a skill. So that was my original intention, after I graduated in history with nothing but secretarial jobs. And so when I went to Arts Center, it just really opened up a whole different visual excitement pattern. And then I thought, well, I'll go to graduate school. I'll pursue photography. Actually, before that, I took a whole summer driving around the country looking for jobs in newspapers, because that was an interest that I had, was the documentary. And it's like, I discovered that those are the kind of jobs that people die in. They just stay in them forever. And I finally got a job at the Pittsburgh Post. Does this sound funny? It's okay? The Pittsburgh Post Dispatch. And it was interesting and difficult, but I enjoyed it very much. But then as I went on with things, I think that my true nature just kind of reared its head. I was never very practical, and I used to have great arguments with my mother about practicality. We used to end up hanging up the phone on each other. So anyway, all that being said, I did go to graduate school, and I was introduced to painting through monotype. I had a friend who was going to CCA as an undergraduate, and she said, I have to take you to the print shop, you're gonna love this, you're gonna love this. So I did these first little monotypes, they're like 5 inches square, and I came home and I plastered them up all over my apartment, and it was like, I was so smitten, it was like my path into painting. And I've just been at it ever since. I think, yeah.
Okay, Kota, I wanted to do something. I saw something on the Haynes website. Kota is represented by Cheryl Haynes, and there's a little statement there, and I wanted to pull a sentence out. Forms and figures become at once visually iconic and emotionally impassive, blurring the line between reality and fiction. And I thought this was really interesting. I know it's like so unfair. You wrote Once Upon a Time, but just take this idea, because I think this is, it resonated with, when I thought about your work, of the form and the figure being iconic. And I think that's what Park does also. He's taken the figure and he's made it very iconic. I think with him, it's not in any way emotionally impassive at all. It's highly charged very often. But could you talk a little bit about the figure and the image and abstracting from it and your interest in doing so?
Yeah, of course that's really difficult. That's why this sentence might be so complex and convoluted. And I still try to figure it out. That's where the word figure comes again. I was actually making completely abstract work when I moved to California. It was all text-based and very kind of hardcore conceptualist, and I was in my mid-20s when I moved here. And then I tried to do this, continue to do this while I was here, and I felt it just didn't work. For me, this whole game of making work is also kind of a conversation with a viewer or with whoever dares to interact with it, and I felt these, my kind of version of Joseph Koussout just didn't do anything. And then I took a really weird detour. I was studying also at the San Francisco Art Institute, and one of the professors there was George Couchard, who recently died, unfortunately, and he was a big influence, and I thought, I'm here now, I'll just turn into this underground filmmaker a la George Couchard, and that was really amusing to my friends, but I also think the work itself didn't do all that much, and then I started doing things like the thing over there in the corner, and maybe it's a mixture between underground film and hardcore conceptualism. It's somewhere in between. It's very graphic, almost like a image text, but also it has elements. There's people in it, just like in underground films. Yeah, my connection to David Park is very loose. I'm not a painter at all, but maybe I am still, because I use color and I produce images. And I always thought that the imagery that I make has to do with my cultural background. I'm half German, half Japanese, and people have commented that the colors in my work are very muted, and I blame that on my German background because it's a very kind of toned down country. And then, but also there is a lot of color going on in my work, and I blame that on my Japanese ancestry. If you think of sushi or Japanese food, it's very colorful, and the whole culture in Japan is kind of a celebration of color. And then recently what made me very happy is I got together with some curators and writers from China who were in town visiting, and they looked at my work, and I don't think they had seen it before, and they commented how much the color in my work relates to colors that they observe in California. So I think without knowing, I turned into some kind of a California painter, and then, that maybe brings me into conversation with people like David Park. About David Park, I also want to say Richard Diebenkorn is maybe a household name worldwide, but David Park maybe lesser so. But I have lots of painter friends from Germany, and they're really excited about the Bay Area figurative movement. They feel always when they come here and pick up a catalog at the Oakland Museum or so that they come upon something really special. Yeah.
I think that's interesting. I have a friend in Berlin, a painter, and when I first met Max, the first thing he said to me when I said, "So what's your work like?" And he said, "Oh, I'm really interested in this thing, Bay Area figurative," and he said, "I'm really into Chris Brown." That was in Berlin. So there is an interest in painting there. Yeah. Allan, would you like to take the microphone? I think it's really interesting that there are these connections, and sometimes we kind of have to look a little deeper. It's interesting that you've all spent time living in different countries. You have mixed cultural influences, and then sometimes things pop up that are shared. And I thought it was interesting that both you, Allan, and Kota have worked, for instance, with the Zapruder images and footage. And could you talk a little bit about how you came to doing the kind of work you do, and the influences and the choices you were making?
Okay. I guess a little bit of background. I came to California in mid-90s from New York to LA, actually, and it's interesting how many overlaps there are in our different trajectories. New York, LA, then I came up here and moved, this sort of movement to different locations. As with most artists, it's a combination of for love and for work. I moved to LA for love and moved to San Francisco for work. So the Art Institute, and again, so much overlap with the Art Institute between us. I was teaching new genres, and then went to UC Berkeley, and again that overlap, and like Chris, who's my sort of predecessor, I'm now the chair of that department. But in terms of how I work, I also started out as a painter, and certainly in undergrad, and then I went to the Whitney program and did the critical studies program, but I was writing fiction. Everyone else was writing art history. Then I went to grad school and did photography. And then since then I've taught, in the performance department, in new genres department, I've taught painting, I've taught text and writing. And this is actually, Berkeley is my first time teaching photography, even though I'm primarily a photographer. And Berkeley also never had a photo program within the art department. It was always in the School of Journalism. And so this is something kind of astounding, that it's only had photography as a core element within the program. And I know it's been taught by different visiting faculty, and Jim, you might have had some say in that. But to have photography only taught within the last 2 years as part of an art program is kind of astounding. But the reason I haven't taught in photography programs before is because I work across different media, and I'm interested in what happens between, or when one medium meets another, what gets produced. And as artists, we're all influenced by painting, that having, certainly along with sculpture, the sort of longest history. And so photography, the language, is partly derived from painting language, and it's had, since the beginnings of photography, and we can go back to, at least the 11th century, where we understood the mechanisms of how a camera would work, even though we never had the chemistry for it until the 19th century. But they've had parallel histories and been mutually influencing. And I'm interested in those kinds of combinations between media, between the still image and between the moving image, between the moving image within video and film and performance. And I also think I'm particularly interested in the relationship between photography and performance. And part of that interest comes out of painting, and painting as a gesture. So there's a performance of the movement, either the arm or this, that produces the painting. And so I'm interested in the gesture that precedes the finished product and is part of the process of making the work. So there are all kinds of influences, and certainly within California figuration, what does that return to figuration mean from abstraction? And of course, the Bay Area was also a prime site for abstract expressionism, so it's sort of parallel to figuration. But how does that emphasis on the gesture coexist with the emphasis on arriving at something that's recognizable as a figure? And certainly within photography, where people don't see the photograph as an object, they see what's depicted. So in that sense, the photograph always works in relation to figuration. You always recognize what's in the photograph. And of course, there's a counter to that with abstract photography. But that's still the primary mode of photography as related to this notion of figuration. And so I'm interested in that too. One of the things, and Livia mentioned this around her own idealism as a young artist, I work a lot with text, and one of the questions I'm pursuing is what language do we as artists have for idealism? Or, for example, if you've been in San Francisco over the last couple of years, you might have seen posters and billboards from the MBA program, I think at UCSF, and the tagline is "Change the world from here," and here being the MBA program. Now that's the language that was learned from the MFA programs, that young artists would come in wanting to change the world, and now it's become the tagline of the business programs. And artists feel too embarrassed to say that anymore, that they actually started out wanting to be artists because they wanted to change the world. And so that just comes across as naive now. And I want to return to that question, and within the text works that I do, is always to examine what kind of possible languages do we have to articulate this idealism. Okay, that was the short answer.
Maybe it looked like Chris wanted to respond to that, maybe? And if and if not, I'll throw a question at
No,
you, Chris.
go ahead, throw a question.
Oh, take the mic.
I'm just lost in thought about all that. That's pretty complicated.
I think
fascinating.
if we look at the work in this exhibition, we'll find that pretty much is a constant for almost all the artists here. This sense of, that's what humanism is a commitment to the well-being and the lives of people in a civilized, productive, peaceful way, and that's what we all hope for. And I think that's what we find here when we have this work gathered around us. That whether one chooses to do it as an artist or a writer or a school teacher, I think that idealism is there and has a very profound effect and motivates, and that's why young people work so hard with such dedication. But the idea that your work and your commitment somehow will take you off in another direction, the way Park, when he decided to, that in terms of what was important for him in art, in fact, depended on using the figure, because the human figure and what is done in life, the activities of life, were what was essential for art and important, that was the crux for him. But in doing so, in stepping away, there was an immediate loss of that support system, because after all, he'd been teaching at the California School of Fine Arts, which is now the San Francisco Art Institute. He had a teaching position. He had work that related to the contemporary conversation in painting. He was right there. And by making this shift, it was seen as being very retrograde in a way. So, I mean, questions come up about those kinds of decisions. What happens when you decide to be in California rather than New York, Chris? I mean, you went through that change. You went to New York, and then you left New York and came back to California. How do you cope and evaluate those consequences for seeing through a particular vision?
A lot of complicated questions there too. Let's see. There's so many dilemmas facing an artist. You know, like, do you want a microphone? Is it better if I use this? Okay, sorry. There's so many questions about one's identity when you try to be an artist. You know, like, where am I going to be? What kind of artist am I going to be? And what does it mean to try to be an artist, to try to be a good artist? What do I think good art is, even? One of the things that happens now, you know, is I don't think it makes so much difference where we live. I think it used to make a lot more difference. Being in New York was really important. Is it as important as it used to be with communication and the internet and all these things, and the fact that we can travel so easily to New York? Artists can show in New York without living there. Is it necessary to be there as much? I'm not so sure that it is. Having lived there myself, I mean, I enjoyed the experience, but do I feel like it really benefited me? Not really. I mean, one of the dilemmas of being a contemporary artist is that you're influenced, being an artist anytime, you're so influenced by the time you live in, but it's not necessarily a good influence. The goal as an artist is to be who you are as richly and significantly as you can, and to imbue your work with your sense of who you are in the most personal way possible. And culture gets in the way of that. It's a real problem for every artist. In a sense, you can't help but be of your time, you know, and everybody wants to be of our time. And our culture puts so much emphasis on this idea of originality, which, I mean, that's a subject in itself. I think it's a real problem for most artists, and I don't think originality is actually that important. I think personal identity is much more valuable for any kind of artist. I mean, in a sense, like, what is there really to talk about? Don't we all experience the same basic world? Now, our individual lives are unique, you know, even though billions of people have lived very similar lives on the planet Earth. You know, our daily life is about the same. Each life is nonetheless unique. And I think we can say the same thing about paintings. There's been so many paintings made. What separates one painting from another? I mean, there's so many things about it, but to some degree, it's the ability of a good artist to make the work be both very specific and intense. And how do you go about doing that? I don't think you do it through culture exactly. I mean, culture gives you a certain degree of intelligence, a certain degree of awareness, I suppose. But I think, as I say, personal identity is much more important. It has a lot to do with things like just the experience of one's own body and life in the world, wherever you are, and making that as personal as possible. And the more personal you can make it, the more universal it seems to become. Yeah, go ahead with a question,
Yeah,
please.
it's sort of interesting because it seems as though, and I actually totally agree with your take on things, but it also seems like Kota would have an extremely different view of that he's almost stripping things away, where you're trying to imbue things, he's trying to strip them away. Is that fair?
For example, this personal identity was, it was a little bit of a problem for me growing up because I was Japanese, half Japanese, grew up in Germany. I didn't really feel German, I didn't really feel Japanese. And then I've moved here and I felt I blended right in. Everybody's just like me. But then what am I, Californian or so? And then I think about it sometimes that there's these very new identities. For example, I thought about the fact that my father moved from Japan to Germany in a ship. He took the ship from Yokohama to Marseille, and then he probably took the train from Marseille to Cologne or so. And that's how he made it there. So without the event of industrialization, I would never have happened. So you need machines now to produce humans. So I feel maybe I'm part of maybe I'm a little bit also of a machine identity, and then now I think people meet each other on the internet, and then they have families or so their children have also some kind of internet technology in their DNA, and so I think identity becomes so complicated. And one of my favorite movies is the movie Blade Runner, that I'm sure a few of you have seen, where it's the first movie that kind of celebrated, there's this woman, Rachel, who's a replicant, artificial human, and she's very much the female heroine of the movie. And I thought it was so nice that people could empathize with an artificial human being. Yeah, that too. But I don't know, I thought there's already so many interesting questions. I really thought it was so interesting what Allan brought up with if art should have this idealism of changing the world, or if just MBAs should take on that task. And I actually remember that there was Karl Marx also really was into changing the world, obviously. And that's maybe he was even before Marcel Duchamp and all these people. Yeah, I think he's kind of the pre-MBA, yeah. But then I don't want to hold the microphone the whole time, because I actually never thought that it's worthwhile trying to change the world with an easel and a brush or something like that. I thought it's just futile. You should leave it to political activists or politicians to change the world, and you should just make something different, But then this particular video in the corner was made in 2004, just in the early stages of the Iraq War. And I noticed in that moment, for example, it was completely impossible to do art that didn't have an activist idea behind it. It was such a charged moment. So in a way, I think you almost can't escape the idea of trying to at least change something, even if it's just your own brain. Yeah.
I'm going to try really hard to have a question mark at the end of this, but would also just want to start out by saying that this is awesome. It's such a spectacularly superpower panel of people who have had such a profound influence on the world and in large part also on my small life. So just right on, and big compliments, Jan. And what I'm wondering a little bit though is I'm wondering if just further to riff off what Kota was just bringing up again, coming from what Allan was saying, and this is a very profound point, and coming a little bit around then to Park, who in a sense, sort of famously takes his meta, proto-modernist works of abstraction and throws them on the trash heap. And the writer Susie Gablick, if that means anything to anybody, talks about that confrontational relationship between, say, artist and product and viewer, that modernism encourages, this idea that it's confrontational, that it's got sharp edges, that it's phallocentric and sort of asserting itself against the viewer. And that Park's reaction against that, to talk about figuration, and indeed to take those abstract language elements and turn them into those nuanced and extraordinary small moments that we share universally, looking over the shoulder of the trumpet player. And the way that the music just comes forward. To that I would want to say that my initial experience with Kota's work was utterly transformational in a moment that I will never forget. And the first time when I moved to this Bay Area and encountered one of his works, which was an abstraction, in a sense, of the O.J. Simpson trial. And then with that, all of a sudden, it took what I thought was this, not so much personal, but unique experience, and turned it into art, and made me believe that indeed art was a part of the world, and that through that it could possibly change it. After already spent a lot of time with art, but it's a moment I'll never, ever forget. And I wonder whether each of you could in some way just continue to riff off that theme of this changing the world by using a figurative, seemingly once outmoded language to create a universal spirit of change and progressivism.
I liked your question. I'm not sure if I can remember it all well enough to respond to it, but I feel like the gist of the idealism is like, my generation, our generation, it's like we're all part of our particular time, like Allan said or Kota said, and ours was this reference to Europe. It was reference to the Enlightenment and to the poetry of the 19th century. It was this feeling that the individual mattered and that was okay, but then you struggled to do things as an individual because that's what you had. And I think subsequent generations are different that way. I think that there's just more group things in play. There's more, there's less idealism, for sure, I think. Maybe that's projection of just, I don't know. But I think in terms of changing the world with your work, I remember feeling very guilty during all these war situations, that I should be saying something about the war. You know, it's like, here I am, I talk about color and gesture and da-da-da, and why aren't I doing something more? And then I finally came to the conclusion that people have to do what they do best, and that there's some sort of language of communication that will come across, that if you're a political activist or a writer who talks about the outside world, you're going to do that more strongly. And someone like myself, I think, when you're talking about the moment in time, I think that I've always sought that in painting. I feel like art is stopping time. I remember I was talking to Edith about Spain, and I just remember this feeling that I had when I was on the train going from north to the south, and you're going through all these vineyards and this greenery, and I remember feeling like I could stop time, that with my work I could stop time and pause it. You know, I could stop it. And I think that digging into painting is my way of stopping time. And it's hopefully people who look at painting would find that too. And maybe when they pause to stop time, they pause to think about what they're doing, and think about the world that we have. So maybe that's the way we can affect change.
I think actually you've just helped to clarify a question that I've had about Park, and that is, how could someone who was in pain, constant pain, facing his own death and knowing that he had so little time, could get together an hour or two a day and produce over those days that he had these amazing works on paper, the gouaches that he did at that time. And you know, I've always seen it as a kind of heroic gesture, but in fact, I think you've answered that for him, he was stopping time with his work. I
would say one thing too, just in response to your comment. You
Guston talked about this question, about his own paintings, saying that he was making these abstract paintings for such a long time in the middle phase of his work. And there he was, as he described, in the middle of the Vietnam War with Richard Nixon president, asking himself, what am I doing? And it was a great motivator for him in moving his work toward figuration. And I think the question for any painter is certainly, what is the result of 100 years of abstract painting? What does it mean to anybody? And I think a lot of painters have come to the conclusion that this great experiment in abstraction is a failure, that it's led us nowhere other than to explore painting in a very pure sense. Pretty outrageous thing to say, but I think to some degree, and a lot of artists have come to the conclusion that abstraction is the equivalent to decoration, and that it's essentially not much more than that, and that the input of an image, however abstracted that image. I mean, one of the things I believe, let me say it a slightly different way, and that is that an image automatically makes a work multi-layered. You're looking at it as that image, and if it's a painting, as both a painting and an image. And that duality is fundamental to a concept in painting. And when you're looking at an abstract painting, you're not really seeing it the same way you look at figuration. We have a different way of looking at abstraction. And that's a problem for abstraction, and it's a great, interesting problem for figuration. And it's what makes figurative painting, and I mean figurative in the broad sense, any kind of representational image, endlessly interesting. No matter what you paint, there's a way of describing it that's not like anybody else described it. And so there's always this possibility of the new metaphor. And it's what makes writing continually vibrant and alive. I mean, however many books have been writing is still interesting to read. Good reading is still a great thing. And great painting is still a great thing for the same reason. It's the same old world, but there are new ways of describing it. And I don't think that's so true for abstraction. How many different ways can you splash paint? I don't think it's so.
Can I say one more thing about? Did you do it? I just wanted to say that the whole thing. I mean, I went through periods where I was painting abstractly, and I think it's a lot harder to make a good abstract painting that isn't decoration than an average figurative painting, because the figurative work, the meaning carries it, the imagery carries it, whereas with abstraction, there has to be so much more depth and really soul put into it. I remember looking at a Guston painting in the LA County Museum, and it was one of his abstractions, and I felt like I wanted to crawl inside it, and I told my students that. I said, do you ever feel like you want to crawl inside a painting? And they looked at me like, oh my God, are you crazy? It's just like they couldn't understand the concept of it. But I think most painters can understand that feeling of just, it's like total connection, it's total immersion. And I think that I tend to feel that a good painting is one that you find a way into.
So I never imagined I would have to come to the defense of abstraction. Yeah, I did. I talked a little bit about how photography it's always seen as figurative, because we've been trained to look for something that's recognizable within the image, and from my perspective, that every artwork functions differently in multiple forms. It's always abstract. Doesn't matter what the work is. Doesn't matter what the medium is. It's always abstract, and by that I mean it's always the material. It's always the first point is the materiality of that object, whether it's a painting, whether it's film, whether it's video, photograph, a performance. So it's a video. It's material and physical presence, and that's true of the gesture as well. Secondly, everything is narrative, because it narrates its own coming into being through this object. If we think of that as an artwork, instant Duchamp ready-made, it tells us its own history of how this particular material comes about, what these insignia mean, and so on. So we can narrate how that object comes into being in comparison with other objects that are similar. You know, we can trace the history of plastic, when it's invented, and so on and so on. So everything is narrative in that sense, and that's equivalent to a sense of figuration, too. A figuration is really a way in, an entry point into a work's abstraction, into its materiality, into its narrative properties. Okay, so there's really no useful distinction between figuration and abstraction. Okay.
This is really, I think we're getting at a lot of really interesting material here. And Livia, you said a good painting is one you find your way into. I would say a good viewer is one who finds his or her way into a painting. But beyond that, I would say Chris is spot on about a lot of abstract art, because there's a lot of abstraction that had utopian hopes and agendas, and people waltz by it in museums and think of it as decoration. And what Chris is saying is, I think, right on, that something needs a little more Velcro than that. And actually, Allan said this, you know, about everything is narrative, figuration is an entry point. But a lot of people need that entry point in order to get into what's beyond it. And they might never get past that entry point. Artists are trained just like just like someone at Bioneers is trained to be able to analyze that plastic bottle and all the implications on the world that you read into it. A lot of other people are not. And artists are trained to read the abstraction and the process behind an artwork that's on the wall on a daily basis. They can go up to it and they can figure that out. But many other people can't, and they're left with a wall obstruction. And the figuration is a way in that people can connect with.
I think this is really interesting, because the word abstraction itself can be many things, and a non-objective painting is a lot different than what some people consider to be an abstract painting. So if it's non-objective, it's not of the body, as we say. And Guston's work, for me, even during its abstract period, is very much of the body. It feels physical. It feels like you're feeling his presence in the work. I don't think he was ever an abstract painter. I've seen his work, but versus, I won't get into it, but there are people who are literally working out of their heads and want theoretically a removal. What I thought was interesting about what you said about being, not of the world, and I've created, I'm arm's length from things. I think all artists are very much making personal decisions every single day in their studio. And I don't think it's possible for the work not to be personal. Do you know what I mean? And you can call it all these things, and curators just love creating all these stories, but I think the most interesting work is based in one's own studio. And I think what Guston did was he said, I'm done with the art world. And I think that's what David Park did as well. Because I think they became bored with trying to keep up. That's my sense of things. And they just wanted to be direct. So anyway, that's all.
I read a statistic once that 60% of Americans hate abstract art. Well, they don't understand it, and it makes them. Well, yeah, but it makes them uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And they don't like it, and so we're so I guess 40% do, and some of those people are trained, but unless you're really trained to understand it, it is a bit obtuse or obscure, or all those strange things. I think that the best work is, as you said, Chris, somebody really getting into themselves and going out and showing what's actually individually inside of them and making that available to other people to see. Someone said something about my work yesterday, which was that they're portals into my reality. And that's what I would like to think I'm trying to make, is manifesting what's inside of me in 3 or 2-dimensional form.
Excuse me, unfortunately, Chris is being called away, and since he started this, I thought he might want to have a little bit of a response or final little piece, because we can keep going, but I thought you might want to have a little response to that.
I'm kind of enjoying everybody else's questions, or comments, but anyway.
Well, I'll take the mic away from you then.
I'm trying to think about how I might summarize this. Nothing's coming to mind immediately right now.
Okay.
If somebody else had a question.
One of the most interesting books that I've ever looked at and often looked at is a very thick book from a retrospective of Mondrian at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And when you follow that, you see how he came from very representational work to gradually simplifying to his abstractions. That he didn't suddenly become an abstract painter. He came to it by modification, simplification, and taking out everything that he felt wasn't relevant. And I think that's an interesting way to realize how one gets to abstraction, when it is meaningful, meaning it's not coming from nowhere. That's all I want to say.
Yeah. I want to just go back to the point that Anne made about this idea, and I don't agree with it, that Park was saying, he'd had it with the art world and was turning his back on the art world. I think, in fact, that he was it was a very positive assertion, because that's why he brought in, and I won't use the term proselytizing, but the idea that he could get Bischoff to turn his back on abstraction and work figuratively and draw from the model, that he could get Diebenkorn to join them, that he could get Hassel Smith and Fletcher. And they all were working for that period of time, and there was an assertion of the validity and value of it. I don't think it was saying that.
I don't think that's what she was saying, though. I think what she was saying was that he was turning his back more on the expectations of the art world. In other words, he wasn't going to respond to what the art world expected him to do.
He's willing to take that risk.
I think that's the only time you can truly paint. It's when you just you just get rid of that burden.
Yeah, I think the artist can really get sucked into what is expected of them. And particularly if they're successful at some level. People expecting them to keep making whatever that was. 3 of those sold, make me 3 more of those. And I think maybe that was is that more when you were getting at?
Yeah, if you become bored following the crowd, sooner or later you find your own work.
Well, I find myself over here particularly struck with this idea of finding your most authentic and richest self in the work and then presenting that. My career was in mental health and working with people in their trajectory in life as individual human beings. It's always fascinating how complicated a struggle that is, and how we all end up at various points along that line, and some go much further. And perhaps looking at art is a way of letting other people know that it's possible to go further in this effort to really become a unique individual self who can live life as that unique person.
So,
I
just
thank
want
you
to...
for waking up the entire audience. It's the way I love it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
We talked about a little bit, does art change the world? And of course, Bubba came out last week, and he thought the way that the ISIS was to use it. And we all have doubts on whether art could change the world. However, today, over several centuries, there's a lot of great monuments that were produced 1,000 years ago. We didn't know who the artist or the architect who created the work, or at least the idea. Today, is it even more about the artist than less about the art? That's changing the movement or changing the art world?
Well, only in a very short term. I mean, just because of the way that media, social media, etc. works, being very instantaneous. But I sort of wanted to go back to, I mean, we're talking about these really huge questions, identity, culture. I sort of have a list here: authenticity, activism, humanism, universalism, and we're assuming that we all have shared meanings and what those are. I personally never ever speak about my own work in terms of identity, and even though Jan mentioned, I think in my little bio. But so for me, identity is always relational. It's never about an authentic self. And you form an identity in relation to people who are like you, and in opposition to people who you think are unlike you. And so it's always, what I'm interested in is that relationship, and what happens in the relationship, which produces both sides of the equation. And so, identity is always something that's continuously being formed. There's never a point when you can say, this is my identity. It's never fixed in that sense, because our relationship in the world never ends until we die. And even then it continues through the people who know us and so on. So for that, for me, is a really problematic term to use so lightly. Same with humanism. I mean, the history of humanism is also, it's always meant to be idealistic. It's never something we've ever arrived at. There's always categories of people who are never fully allowed to be fully human. We see that in every aspect of homelessness, incarceration, policing, wars, justice, etc., etc. There's always categories of people who are never treated equally. And so we can never talk about humanism as being something in the present. And if it's ever manifest in art, it's always aspirational to a future. Okay, so there's another term that I'm totally uncomfortable with. Universalism, similar to humanism, it's an aspiration. We want to think that we all have the same interests. We don't. I mean, just watch the news. We know we don't. And also, it's presumptuous to think that what I experience is experienced by somebody else in similar ways. We don't have that shared language. We don't, there's something, and actually, one of the problems I have with humanism and also the question of universalism is that it's too linked to empire and colonialism. And so it's the imposition of a certain form of knowledge. Whoever is within that colony or part of their empire is now within the realm of the human. But there's always someone outside of that. Okay. So these are terms that are certainly we can use them. I think universalism is something we can aspire to. That's also a question of social justice in the present. Similarly with humanism. So these are all, highly problematic terms. Even the equation between what's inside us and what's outside of us, again, I think of that as relational. What's inside is a response to what's outside. And so there is nothing authentic inside us that can be manifest in an artwork. It's always about the relationship. And that's also the viewer as an active part of this relationship. I don't fully agree with the viewer having to be trained to abstraction. And again, if we think of non-Western cultures that might have proceeded from abstraction towards, forget about European modernism, the trajectory is from figuration towards abstraction. That's not a global phenomenon. So I can give an example again of a sort of Hindu temple where the outside is highly decorated with the physical forms of the human and animal. You go into the first sanctuary and you get plant-like forms which are abstracted, they're patterned. So there's a base, so pattern already becomes an abstraction from the base animal. Okay. Then you go into another one, and it becomes even more stylized. And then you go into the inner sanctuary where there's nothing. There's no decoration whatsoever. And so there we can see it's a highly philosophical movement away from the physical to the aspirational to the spiritual. And that's part of the language that Western abstraction has adopted. Mondrian is a classic case. He gets his ideas from theosophy and anthroposophy. Same with Kandinsky. I'm writing actually about Mark Rothko. Rothko, again, he looks at Assyrian, Sumerian architecture and those block forms, which he then builds into these floating rectangles. It's not as direct as that, but we can say these artists are trying to situate themselves in the world. And it's up to us as viewers never to forget the whole world is part of that ambition in every artwork. And so what does Rothko now mean in relation to Syria? Assyria, ancient Assyria, but Syria now in the present. And that's the questions that we have to ask as viewers. It's too easy to go to these questions only of humanism, universalism, interiority, exteriority, without putting them to the test. Okay.
Question about that. When you were speaking about the narrative quality and materiality of a work of art, the narrative of a work's inception, it seems to me, I don't know how to include the viewer in the inception of the work. And I think of the inception of the work as coming from the unique identity, the mind, the spirit, soul, the completeness of the creating artist. And I think of there being a kind of authenticity in that entity, not that it's separate from the world, of course, but in that moment of creating work, the viewer is not participating.
I have an answer to that, even though the question was posed to Allan, because I agree with Allan that the viewer is a really big part of the equation, and I'm kind of the I'm much too young to be a rock and roller, but I'm also a little bit too young to be original punk rock. But I felt that punk rock was the musical style after rock and roll that really acknowledged the audience much more than rock and roll did. In rock and roll you can play a really great guitar solo, and that's just the merit of the song. But in punk rock it was not so important how well you play the guitar, but it was important that you stage dive, that you jump into the audience and that the audience throws beer at you. And this kind of relationship with the audience is central to the music. But I wanted to say, I've been trying to keep a comment to something that Olivia said earlier that I'm dying to bring forward, which is this. It was still kind of at the part of this abstraction and activism discussion, and I think that abstract work can be really political, and abstraction and also beautiful work can be completely activist. And I think sometimes we think of political just to be this left versus right or conservative versus liberal, but political is this old idea of how you organize a community of people living together. And I think it comes from ancient Greece, and I find that they built their whole political system around art. They had the temples and the statues and so forth, and the political system was really just there to protect the statues. And of course we...
Or vice versa, maybe the statues were there to protect the political system.
Yeah, but it's really, and I think it actually also harkens back to Olivia's comment about stopping time. It's the German, Jewish, American philosopher Hannah Arendt once said that what she enjoys most about art is its uselessness. That art is really completely useless. You can't do anything with these things that are in this room here, except maybe look at them or break them. But political systems build themselves around these useless systems, and then here everything is geared towards uselessness. usefulness, and usefulness is not really helping the political progress. We need more uselessness to have a functioning political system. Oh no, that was just because you said that you thought that your work was not activist, but I think just by making useless things, you are an activist.
It's interesting.
Well, I just wanted to say something, because this is getting a little confusing for me, to say the least, though extremely interesting. And I'm sorry Chris isn't here, because I really did like his idea of authenticity. And I think it's the hardest thing to do in this world, in this culture at this time. I think finding your kernel of who you are, and even though I might disagree with you on this, there is a relationship, and I think there's constantly a pushback of not being or finding ourselves, or finding ourselves and not being able as an artist to demonstrate it, whatever medium you're in. You know, I think there's a huge amount of fear in most people, but I think there are commonalities too. Even though we're all so very different and we're all very unique, I think, and our cultures can be incredibly varied. I think that there's some very basic human qualities that we all experience. And certainly when I see David Park's work, I think the woman with her hand on her chin, I mean, it gives me the chills, because I feel he saw me in some way. I can relate to that figurative so much. It's like it's a moment of daily life that he put in a few strokes that is quite meaningful. So all of these discussions are amazing, but some of it I get lost.
So I would say that what Edith said about Mondrian and the book, the big fat tome that you brought home from MoMA, and Allan, what you said about the Hindu temple, or what one might say about the Upanishads and Shankya, and things, I mean, are both examples of a narrative playing out in time, and then as you move through that temple, you're moving through the layers of apprenticeship and of initiation. That's a narrative. It's not happening all at once. Same thing with Mondrian. He's moving through those stages, and you're able to move through that with him. But the final stage, if you just arrive at that, you have not moved through that narrative with him. You're just there in front of that painting, and you may or may not have experienced what he went through as he stripped away all what he thought was unnecessary. Same thing with the Hindu temple, if you were just plopped into the center. So I guess my question for you, Allan, is I want to ask you your question. What is the relevance and value, and I'm not saying there's not one, I'm curious about this question, it's a great probing question, of Rothko in Syria, not Assyria, today?
I actually have an answer.
Great, I love that.
But before I get to it, it is a question of language. The sort of classic example that's given is that we all acquire language. There's steps to acquire it, as a sort of mother tongue. But then we can also learn other languages, and so there's a kind of immersion in language, and that's something that we have in common, to greater or lesser extents. And so I think of the artist in similar ways, and again, this is not my argument. So as artists, we acquire the language of whatever medium we're working in, and of culture in general. Okay? And so the ideas we draw upon are already floating within culture. Now, how we use that language, and we can do this with verbal speech, is that each one of us can have our own intonations. We put words in combination in our own specific ways. We have a very particular set of influences that no one else has. And that's how we extend the language. We make it our own. And I think that's what artists do in any medium. And I think that comes a little back to your question around what makes it authentic. For me, it's the extending of the language that we've inherited, and that we're constantly inheriting because our languages change, continuously. But it's the time we have to work with the language that enables us to extend it, I think. And obviously we do it through whatever medium. So Rothko. It's kind of a trick question, because, I was looking at the Rothko retrospective at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, and I think it's probably in Washington, Washington State at the moment. I think it's on there now. Yeah. And I was having that question, trying to understand what is happening to me when I look at the Rothko, and how much of it is me having been trained as a viewer, having known Rothko and being trained through Rothko as an art student. And Rothko and his contemporaries represent a certain culmination of what gets taught in art history or in art departments, in studio departments. Everything ends in New York. All art histories end in New York in the 1960s. That's usually the end of art students' education. And so someone like Rothko becomes the culmination. And for me, then who comes from multiple histories outside of that, like, where do I figure in this? And what does it mean for me now to look at this abstract painting, which is over 50 years old? Okay, what does it mean in the contemporary? So I started photographing them in very close detail. And then the photographs I ended up with look uncannily like some of the images from 91 that we were seeing in the news, the first invasion of Iraq. Like the sort of green night vision images. Yeah. And if you look at the edges where one color meets another in Rothko, there are those splashes, those little tracking marks of the brush. Those details actually look like our TV screens, and they look like images of war. Of course, Rothko has no intention of that. But so this is part of the sort of activating a viewer, that we can bring what we want to work. At the same time, as I've researched Rothko, I've spent a long time with him, I've read about him, so I know the milieu in which he's functioning, his aspirations for his work. That doesn't cancel out my own responses. They can add to it in different ways, but I can also have these multiple responses.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and coming back to your point about different words that you had written down, assuming that those have universal meaning to everybody and are experienced in the same way, is sort of an arrogant assumption. I remember having a very interesting conversation with Catherine Riesner, who at the time was leading the deSouza, and I was saying that I was really appalled that labels had been put on the wall, and she found herself in the odd position of defending the labels. And so she told me I was arrogant. But she pointed out why I was arrogant. She was right. She said, you have all the vocabulary to walk into a room with art and to respond to art with all that history being brought to bear. And for the 60% of the people, or I think it's probably closer to 90% of the people who do not like abstract art or hate abstract art, they lack vocabulary. And so I think that you're right. I think it's sort of interesting. It would be an interesting experiment to throw a piece of art out to people with widely different backgrounds and then just get their varying responses to it, because I think the response to art is a function of the vocabulary that they bring to bear, which I think is kind of your point.
And also where we encounter the work. If you encounter the same work in someone's garden or in the street, you probably wouldn't think of it as art.
Well,
so it's not necessarily the object itself.
I think Rothko, I've had my own personal history with Rothko. Looking at him through different periods of my own work. And I discovered him when I was much younger, and I could really see his trajectory, you know, from the Jewish immigrant to the big screen and the whole thing. But there's a lot of work that's not about words. It's not about background. I mean, I've seen people in museums who have absolutely no training, I think. You know, just the average person, you know, you probably just could ask them, you know, have you ever taken an art history class? And they'd say no. You know, it's just like, I think that Rothko had this religious mission, and his paintings were his religion. And they were about, you know, the color and the light and the transformation. And it's like he was very pragmatic, I feel like, about wanting to have that and wanting to display that. And consequently, when I realized that, there are other periods where I just couldn't really enjoy Rothko the way I did originally. You know, that his authentic self wasn't what I felt in the work. You know, it was more like the abstraction only took me to a certain point with Rothko. And he was very arrogant. You know, he was very arrogant. You know, he just did a lot of stuff that was pretty personally arrogant. And he was also pretty depressed. But
so where do you end up now, Livia? When it sounds like you've had different.
Yeah, I think that it doesn't give me what it used to. You know, that there's not enough there. You know, and particularly like with Diebenkorn, like with the Ocean Park. You know, it's like he's always been at the top of my pyramid in a sense. But it's like I look at the Ocean Park series and I think, my God, this man did too many of them and too much alike, because it's like the ones, there are too many that to be authentic. You know, that there are too many that are the same. They can't feel authentic to me. And yet they're.
I have to say that the more I see of the Ocean Park, when you put them together, the more you see how different they all are. I feel just the opposite. That with, I mean, Ocean Park is not like my favorite. I would take the Berkeley paintings out over, and certainly the figurative. But when I look at the Ocean Park, I just think it's phenomenal how wide-ranging and deep his thinking is, and what he pulls out of the paint.
I think he did it more on the works on paper for the Ocean Park ones. I think that those have the real transitoriness, the real subtlety that the big giant paintings can't always capture.
I guess that's always a question whether, there's always a question whether it becomes repetition or whether it's an artist really pursuing all the possibilities of one idea. I don't know if there's an easy way to judge that.
How do you feel about Albers and color versus Rothko and color?
I don't feel like I'm touched by it.
Let's not talk about
I couldn't hear you.
No, I feel like I'm not really touched by Albers. I've looked at his work a lot, just like I'm not really touched by Picasso most of the time. And they're completely different. But there's just something, yeah.
Could you give Kota some, I think Kota was, were you ready to say something before?
Excuse me. Well, I wanted to say that I think that I'm sensing this generational point of view here, a difference. And it's interesting to me in terms of our take on the words humanity and authenticity and that kind of thing, because you guys look like you're maybe in your 40s, or I don't know.
We're closer in age than we are.
I just I think that you two have a sort of a different point of view than most of us who are, say, in our 60s or more. I just sense that you look at things differently because of your training in whatever, academia. But philosophically, the whole idea of, the authentic self, and that, like the abstract expressionists firmly believed that there was an authentic self. In fact, you could be heroic. I mean, when you talk about these things, I really sense that you're really imbued in a lot of the more philosophical discussions that are going on now about whether there even is an authentic self. I mean, or do we change constantly in terms of who we're relating to?
Yeah, I think those were more discussions, certainly in theory, in the sort of 70s and 80s, around authenticity.
This whole this embrace of an authenticity, on the first glance maybe it seems really warm, but I think it can put you in some really weird territories, which is then if it's all about the author and the personal thing that comes out through the artwork, are only interesting, exuberant people allowed to make art, or are boring people also not allowed to make art? And then I think one reason why I moved to the United States is because from really early on, I really loved Andy Warhol and what he said. And he always thought that his work was really boring, and that there is also a right for boring people to make art. And then if everybody has to be interesting and deep and authentic and so forth, then that's really mean towards the boring people of us. But also, I'm not at all an authority on Mark Rothko. I'm not. He comes up also in my discussions with students and so forth, because it has to do with this connection between your personality and your artwork and how much that shines through, because of everything that I heard of is the same thing that you just alluded to, that Mark Rothko was not a likable person at all. I heard he didn't leave anything to his family when he died, and he was really...
gossip as sort of informal knowledge, but I don't know, we need to go there.
But then and some of the criticism that artists living today, like Jeff Koons or so, have to endure is that they're not very likable people. How can you like their work? And I don't have an answer to it, but is it important that the person that makes the work is likable?
I think that in Koons' case, it's the opposite. I mean, it's like, I don't care anything about his personality, but I don't think the work is very... it's like, it doesn't get in my way. In fact, it's just, I don't like Koons because I don't like Koons' work. And I think...
We would also stop looking at like half the art that's being produced because of the personality of the artist.
Yeah, I think that we're dealing with, there was something you were saying about the words of idealism, universalism, was latched onto by the colonialists. And I think that that's a newer view of history that is around than when I was being educated in history. I mean, I think that there's buzzwords, and everything now is like a buzzword. But I think that taken out of the political context, taking away the political context, the words themselves are very multi-layered and very thick. They're really much about the fabric of our humanity. And I think that, I think we have to have them, but we have to get beyond them. We can't just throw them away because they're politically expedient.
So I think you might be right about different forms of knowledge and where they come into play. So, and it's true that I'm drawing a lot from post-colonial studies. I'm born in a colony while it was still a colony. And so post-colonial studies doesn't come into the academy, probably still hasn't really entered art schools, but it doesn't come into the academy until, late 70s, 80s, into the 90s. And so there's a whole body of knowledge, which is essentially the rest of the world outside of Europe, that doesn't come into Western academies. Or it comes in, through area studies, for example, Frankfurt, for example, is the biggest center for Sanskrit studies, but it comes in through this sort of colonial trajectory. And the counter to that is much more recent. So it's true, I'm drawing upon more recent bodies of knowledge and investigation. Not that these are new forms of information and knowledge, they just haven't been within academia. They haven't been documented, they've been erased, they've been discounted, they've been ridiculed. And so, they've been around for, forever, as long as any documentation has been. But how they come into play within the contemporary world is what I'm interested in. And so you're right. So I'm drawing upon a whole other system of knowledge.
Yeah, I'm feeling like your definition of humanism is much larger than, because of your perspective, because of who you are, where you grew up, what you've been through. It's different than mine, which sounds like mine was like being formed in the, 1960s or something, I don't know.
Yeah, so, I'm partly interested in, and not to discount any forms of knowledge, and that's why I'm looking at Rothko. It's like not to discount him, but like how does someone like him function in the present? And so my interest is to uncover different kinds of knowledge and to see what's the most applicable that allows us to understand the world we're living in the present.
Do you think he does function in the present?
I think any knowledge system functions in the present, and it's up to us as viewers to make that the case. Like, how do we understand something and its effect within the present? So,
the painting isn't about that. The painting, he didn't care about that. He always, it's like when people ask you what your painting is about, and you say, if I had the words, I wouldn't be a painter, and if I had the words, it wouldn't. And there's something so far afield in words from what a painting really is that sometimes I think that it's an insurmountable gulf that you're trying to just find words to make people wouldn't be affected by paintings the way they are if they had the words for it. It's not about the words.
So, I think that's to misunderstand me. So I'm not trying to say that words would do the same or have the same effect upon us as a painting or any other medium. I did mention, painting as a language. So, paint is the medium, but painting as a practice, as something historical, is a language. As that painters learn and then can extend. And we know we can translate from one language to another. It doesn't mean what's translated into is the same as the other language. There's an approximation or an equivalence depending on the abilities of the translator. We know it's never going to substitute for the original thing. You try and find something as equivalent as possible, knowing that other things will never be translated between them. And vice versa. So things that could be done in words could never happen in painting. I don't think that's a problem.
Well, I think I've read about poetry being closer to painting.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's a possibility.
And certainly we could think of painting as enacting certain kinds of visual poetry.
Well, to kind of shift back and sort of bring some final focus here in terms of of language. And well, what happens when you in fact decide to change your language, not just, you know, the vocabulary, but completely change your language, as Park did. And I was thinking, this goes way back to the beginning, Kota, when you said that you started out working with language and that you stepped back from that. And I was wondering if you could talk, just sort of, we can have some like discussion of that shift and what it meant and what you encountered and how that is. I mean, how, you know, how do you actually bring yourself to make that kind of a change and give up that position that you're in? Because if you're in Düsseldorf at one point in time, it has a real meaning to do what you're doing, and it has a totally, I mean, it has hugely different meaning to change your language like that. So could you maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I really also thought it was such a nice comment that Olivia just made about the inadequacy of language to add anything to the experience of a work of art, or to explain it, or to describe the thinking behind it, or something like that, because the work itself is a form of thinking, and then to describe the thinking that's exterior to it just muddles the pie. So but I do also like this exercise of speaking and talking, but I feel it's almost kind of a separate enterprise altogether.
It's a substitute.
Yeah.
It's a parallel activity.
Yeah.
It's being multilingual.
Yes. Yeah. It's, and it's also it's also some kind of rap music. You know, we're just for rappers passing the microphone and making rhythms with our tongues, and it's also that. But to go back to your question, with how I changed. I don't use. I actually recently had a show in Berlin where I used text again. So I'd never say like I'm never going to do that again. I'm never going to do that again. But I found that actually making a drawing is also writing a text. It's really exactly the same. It's just text. These geometric shapes like the letter E or the letter V. They're a short form for something that you can also do using a different shape or a different form. And then text is also just geometric shapes like squares and circles. And they also have just, I never felt I had to completely disassociate myself from what I've done in the past. It just changed its visual form.
Any final questions? Rick.
So when putting this show together, the human spirit, and of course you understand that you have the space to develop the exhibition, how did you go about selecting the artists, and secondly, the work itself?
Well, this was a great joy for me because I got to pull together artists and work that I have loved for a long time. And so I've loved Kota's piece. I really also, as James was saying, the O.J. Simpson piece is very powerful, but I wanted this piece because it addresses art so directly. And Judy Dater's self-portrait, I've loved that for decades. I've known it. I think the drawings of Terry St. John, who's going to have a solo show here in June, are really wonderful. So it was a way of pulling in work that I thought was very important, not just great art, but really was very important and valuable for what it says about our lives, about how we exist and how we relate to each other, to the environment, to history. Basically, I called all my friends. That's it, yeah. And just as we've called out to you, many of you are our very dear friends also, and we thank you for your support of the Richmond Art Center. We're so grateful to these fabulous artists who are so generous always with their art, with their art process, their thinking, and being so open with us. We have coffee, refreshments. We hope that you'll get something, have a chance to chat, and the conversation continues. We have another program next Sunday. We hope that you'll be able to come back. John Zarabel will be here. DeWitt Chang will be here. We'll have a discussion of the critical impact of those kinds of decisions that are made. Thank you very much.